Did you leave a lipstick mark on my
I
hand?
definitely just did!
Welcome back, my silly dress idea enthusiasts. This is not wedding content, but it is still very gay content for Pride Month. Now this year, with the whole plague situation, I was unable to engage guilt-free in any Pride activities, seeing as how I was still a plague rat due to how late I became eligible to receive the vaccine. So I decided to do this instead. This dress took about 4 yards of the rainbow and white striped fabric and an additional 4-ish yards of white cotton muslin as lining. And for once, this is a pattern that you can actually follow at home. I used the bodice pattern from Vogue 8789 on this, in view A to be exact, and although I made some alterations like lining it and putting the zipper in a different seam, the base of this is just the same bodice pattern from that Vogue pattern. 8789 is a vintage Vogue pattern, which means that this collection is based off either an original vintage pattern that is being reprinted by Vogue, or off of patterns taken from an original vintage dress. And view A on this pattern is cut on the bias, or essentially the diagonal grain of the material, which is why I picked it when I came up with the strong desire to make a rainbow stripe chevron dress. Now, none of the alterations that I made to this pattern were because of anything Vogue did that was inherent to the pattern. I just had a fairly transparent fabric, so I needed to line it to make sure that none of the stripes would show through on the other side where the fabric was folded over for the facing, and also because I knew all of my undergarments were going to be black and thus were likely to show through this very white fabric. I will freely admit that this is not the most fabric efficient way to cut this out, but I really wanted my pattern piece stripes to match very exactly, and I wanted the purple one to be at the top. So I went through and did the painfully simple pattern matching technique of putting the piece that had already been cut face down on the fabric, and then moving it until the stripes lined up exactly around the edges. This is a very simple and easy way of matching your patterns when you have a fabric like this that has stripes, especially when you're cutting on the bias, which can tend to warp the fabric a little bit. Now, to be fair, the pattern for the skirt that comes with this is just fine. There's nothing wrong, it's just a gathered skirt. You will still end up with a beautiful, full 1950s dress. However, I wanted my chevron pattern, that little point that you see at the center front of the bodice, to continue all the way down the front of the dress. And that would have really sucked and wasted a lot of fabric, even more than a circle skirt, had I tried to do it on this striped fabric. So, I decided to draft a circle skirt for this. And I hate math, so here's a tip. I always cheat on my circle skirts by just typing my finished waist measurement for the garment into the by hand London circle skirt generator, which does the math for you, and then just work out from there. And this skirt is 27 inches long, arbitrarily because my paper could only support a circle skirt that was going to be 27 inches long. I then spent many hours arranging my circle skirt pieces on top of each other to get them to all line up correctly. And the only way that I could get that chevron at the front and all sides was to cut this into 4 quarter of circles with the correct waist measurement for a full circle and sew them together. It's not a method I particularly recommend, and especially if you decide to keep the original side zipper, your skirt will look just fine if you decide to draft a circle skirt for this pattern and then just cut it into 2 half-circle skirts due to fabric limitations. Like, your skirt will look fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I just really wanted to flex with my pattern matching. Also after that, I cut out the lining, although I didn't bother to film me cutting out the lining because it's just the same process but in white cotton muslin, so it really isn't exciting to look at. Just to know that I kept the correct grain line as was marked on the pattern so that I didn't have to worry about any fabric discontent against each other. Then I did up all of my darts now that everything was marked and cut out, and they're just some pretty standard darts as you would expect to see on a 1950s dress. I will warn you, if you are the kind of person that really hates retro shapewear, you do really need a retro bra in order to fill this dress out properly. It really doesn't want to be in a standard like t-shirt bra shape. You really do need that separated and coned effect. Then I aligned the center front, and make sure to trust the process and line up all of your stripes if you intend to do this, because you really do need to line up the stripes, not the edges of the fabric, to make sure that your stripes don't end up ever so slightly off. And it was at this point that I realized that all of my stripes on the side and the shoulders also lined up. So that was cool. Didn't intend for that to happen, but it was cool. I did up the shoulder seams also using that method that I described before of lining up the stripes rather than the fabric, because the fabric can always be trimmed off, but you will notice if the stripes are misaligned when they're so close to being perfectly matching. And you don't have to do the funky thing that I did in order to put the lining in here of going around the arm side and then doing up the side seams later. I just did that because I knew that if I used the armhole facing that is provided in the pattern, because this dress is originally unlined, that I was going to be able to see stripes through the outer layer of the fabric, so I just went for a whole hog lining. Then I spent a bit faffing around with the self-facing and clipping edges to get it to lay very flat. If you've never worked with a pattern with a self-facing, that's what that little weird point is in the bodice pieces. It essentially is an extra bit of fabric that folds over and moves the raw edge farther away from the neckline, and then that piece can get finished separately without you having to worry about any visible top stitching or weirdness being on the very front and center of your neckline. In order to create the lining for this dress, I cut off the self-facing portion in the muslin, which I actually don't recommend doing. My neckline was a little bit floppy. I think the self-facing was originally intended to be interfaced, and I just overlooked it while I was reading the pattern, but I think it would have done better with a little something stiffer in order to keep it laying flat and straight. And then to attach it, I ignored all side seams and did up the arm side instead. Obviously right side to right side, leaving a little bit at each edge of the arm side so that I could do up each side seam separately and then finish that last little bit of the arm side underneath the armpit once those side seams were done up. Once those arm sides are done up, you can turn the fabric inward so that your wrong side of your lining and your wrong side of your fashion fabric are facing each other, and then voila! You have a very nicely finished lining. You just have to tack the self-facing down on the inside. Well, I always choose to whip stitch my facings down just because I hate it when they flop around all over the place. I don't want to iron something every time that I wear it. to make sure my skirt pieces didn't warp or come out of alignment, I pinned them pretty thoroughly to their muslin lining counterparts, and then pinned the front ones together. And once again, I'm aligning them well via stripes with pins, although on this piece it was a little bit harder since I was using the stripes as a guide, but I was also having the muslin behind those stripes, so I couldn't quite see the stripes through the muslin and the backside of the fabric, and it just made things a little bit harder for me. And you may notice at this point that I'm not finishing these edges at all, and in truth it's because they don't really need to be finished. This is on the bias, so the diagonal grain of some quilting cotton. Quilting cotton does not tend to fray very much at all, and on top of that, there's no long strings of fabric on the cross grain, so there's not really anything that frays. So I can move straight on and only worry about the fraying on the pockets. I also wasn't that concerned because I don't intend on really washing this that often, because there's not really a whole lot of occasions in life that call for a bright rainbow chevron striped dress. At least not enough to really be concerned with washing it on a regular basis. However, if you find a similar fabric in blues and grays instead of the rainbow, I would be delighted to hear about it, because I would love a copycat of this dress in slightly more usable color. While my side seams just get a plain unfinished edge, my pockets are getting French seamed, which means that I pin my pockets essentially so that they're facing the outside of my skirt, sew that up, and then turn it to the other side so that it is in, the right side, and then you can use that to sew around again while you are finishing up the seams, and then you end up with a really nicely finished seam on the inside of your pocket, because all of those raw edges have been turned to the inside and then sealed away inside of that second line of stitching. Plus, if you catch the edge where the pocket meets the regular side seams in the right way, you can really ensure that your pockets stay flipped on the inside instead of wanting to have any of the pocket peek out from inside of the skirt. Now, with the pockets installed and the side seams done up, I now had a skirt and a bodice, and they needed to be married together. Now, the layers of the skirt are already married, so both of them get pinned and then sewn down to the outside layer of the bodice. Just the outside layer, because the lining will be pinned down separately. And actually with this, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone with my lining, because Vogue says to also install a waist tape to reinforce the waist and keep it from stretching out. Now, the pattern calls for belting, if I'm not mistaken. Belting is something a little bit different from what it was in the 50s, so I'm just using a bit of grosgrain ribbon, as the stuff that dog leashes are made out of is not the best thing to use at the waist. And while I was whip stitching that lining and grosgrain ribbon down, I also went through and just whip stitched my self-facing at the neckline really quickly, because like I said earlier, I hate floppy facings. With that bit of tedious handwork done, I was able to move on to my zipper. Now, I decided to move the zipper from the side to the back. There was already a back seam in this, and I wanted pockets on both sides, because I never know what to do with my other hand when there's only a pocket on the one side. Someone who was more apt to flex on their pattern matching skills probably would have put it in the side anyway. However, I am not that person. That person also would have probably used an invisible zipper. However, I am still not that person, and every time I install an invisible zipper, wherever I hit any sort of seam, I always end up getting that zipper stuck and breaking it and leaving me trapped in the dress. And I prefer not to be trapped in dresses, so I used a regular polyester zipper because I am not a masochist. After that, I moved on to public enemy number 2, a tiny hook and eye. Now, I don't use teeny tiny hooks and eyes unless I can't avoid it, but I realized that all of my other hooks and eyes that I have right now are either the size of a quarter, way too big for this project, or a skirt hook and eye, which was not going to work for this project because it was at the top of the zipper, so I had no choice but to use a tiny hook and eye. If you've ever made a circle skirt before, you know that circle skirts require either an all-out facing, to be bias taped, or to be a really tiny hem. So I went with my 1/4-inch rolled hem for this one, and please say a prayer for this iron. I stole it from my dad when I moved out. It's about 22 years old, and it's making a burning smell when I iron stuff now, so I think it's finally dying. Now, someone like Bernadette Banner or a home ec student from the 50s would probably go through and hand stitch this hem down with a cross stitch or a whip stitch. However, I am neither of those things. I am merely very tired. So I went through and I just sent the whole thing fuming through my sewing machine after steaming the life out of it. I'm fine with that for a piece like this. It doesn't need a ton of hand finishing. I now have advice for anyone who either can't afford a reproduction bra or wants a less pointy shape. Find an old lady bra, like the Playtex 18-hour bra. Full coverage, maybe labeled as a minimizer bra. Make sure it has a horizontal seam across each cup. Then, check the reviews. There should be at least one-star review saying that the tits are pointing in different directions and are shaped like cones or torpedoes. Then, look at the 5-star reviews. They should have older ladies saying that the bra is supportive and makes them look perky, and maybe that it gives them good separation. And you know what? I put off filming these final outro finished project clips for a week while I waited for my old lady torpedo bra to come in, and it was absolutely worth it. I would give a bra like that 5 out of 5 stars, because not only does it fill out a vintage shape very nicely, but it is so supportive. Things are not going anywhere. Anyway, like this video if you liked this video. Subscribe if you would like to see more silly dress ideas. I have many planned in the future. And hit the notification bell if you wish to be notified, because hitting the subscribe button does not do that for you. If you would like to see more regular updates from me, you can follow me on the social medias that will be linked down below. There will also be a link to my Discord board on which I am quite active. It's a wonderful place for queer historical costumers, as well as all sorts of queer artsy-fartsy folks. It's a wonderful place to hang out. My betrothed is in there, and she is the funniest person on earth. But I may be biased about that.